Right, can everybody just chill out a little bit, please? Alex O'Connor just admitted it. Christianity might actually be true. He debated Christians for years, then admitted this about Jesus. Did Alex O'Connor convert to Christianity? Alex O'Connor is no longer an atheist? Alex O'Connor, no longer an atheist. Here's why. Alex O'Connor, no longer an atheist. Here's why. Part 2. Alex O'Connor just admitted this about Christianity. Did Alex O'Connor change his mind about Christianity? Are you ready to die, cosmic skeptic? Okay, that one actually sounds a bit like a threat, but I'm sure it's driving at the same thing. Okay, so what happened? Something super significant must have gone down to cause all of this ruckus. Well, I'll tell you. I recently had a conversation with Bear Grylls in which he asked me where my study of Christianity and theology has led me, and I told him, wait for it, that I think Christianity is more plausibly true than the new atheists do and than I did when I was a teenager. Can you believe it?
But you've had such a journey and you've met so many amazing people and you've debated so many different angles and things. Yeah. Where's it led you to?
It's led me to, well, I used to be quite on board with the new atheism stuff. I've spoken about this a lot on my show.
What does that mean?
You know, like the sort of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, it was really popular, the debates that they were doing, they called it new atheism.
Yeah.
And it was this body of atheist thought with the God delusion and this kind of stuff, which was really popular. And it had this sort of quite strident, debate me bro kind of attitude. And I was really swept up by that. I thought that was really exciting and cool. And I was beginning to sort of shake that off and grow up a bit, essentially. And then running the podcast, what I've realized is that this is far more interesting and intricate. And I would say plausible than I'd given it credit for before. So, I'm still not a Christian. Not true, not even plausible, but just more plausible than I thought when I was a teenager. And it was actually a clip of this moment which went out on my second YouTube channel that caused all of these responses. I mean, can you believe it? A non-believer in God, like me, is willing to attribute more plausibility to Christianity than someone like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, or indeed his own teenage self. Can you believe it? I mean, I can't think of a single explanation as to why that would be the case, except that he's secretly on the verge of some kind of grand conversion. No, he's too clever for that. He would never become a Christian. It must be that he's realized Christianity is cool again, and he wants to capitalize on an increased viewership by leaning into Christianity, thereby making a whole lot more money. Okay, so here's what really happened. If you've watched my channel for any amount of time, you'll know that I'm quite a staunch critic of Christianity and religion and theism in general. And when I was 17 or 18 and I started making videos, I was a lot more forthright with that atheism. I thought that atheism wasn't just true, but beneficial for society. I thought that religion was harmful. I was really in line with the new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who influenced me greatly into a position that religion is just this utterly irrational and evil force in the world. In the past decade, I've come to see this as something of a shallow view. I think it depends on the religious tradition, because they're quite different. I think it depends on the time in history. I think it depends on the cultural context. And yeah, of course, any historian or sociologist will tell you that it's never as straightforward as I think the new atheists made it out to be. But also on the point of God's existence, I also think that the new atheists didn't really give enough credence to some of the arguments for the existence of God. Richard Dawkins, for example, in The God Delusion, spends 2 pages on Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways. 2 pages. And I think in a way that doesn't properly deal with the significance of the arguments that Aquinas was putting forward. Now look, I still don't believe in God. Okay? I just don't think that it's true. But what I will say is that when I was 17 or 18 and I was swept up with this kind of material, I thought that all of the arguments for God's existence were complete nonsense, and that all the arguments against God's existence were an epitome of perfect rationality. I've now come to prefer the term agnostic over atheist. I mean, it's a problem in itself, even trying to define what God is and what God would look like, but I think there are good reasons to believe in God. I also think there are very good reasons to not believe in God. And some of you might be thinking, what, good reasons to believe in God? What are you talking about? I don't mean conclusive reasons. I don't mean that I have an argument which should compel a rational person to say that God exists. I just mean that there are compelling considerations. And look, I don't really want to go into them now, and I don't have time exactly, but that's not even the point, because all this video is a clip from a podcast in which, by the way, Bear Grylls just asks me, where has this led you? And I say, what, since the beginning of my career? I mean, I think it's more plausible than I did when I was a teenager. That's it. That's not an extraordinary thing to say. I mean, if you were listening to a Christian who started out when they were 17 on YouTube talking about why Christianity is definitely true, and someone asked them 10 years later where their exploration of philosophy had led them, and they said something like, I've got to say, atheism has a lot more going for it than I thought when I started when I was 17. It posed a much sort of bigger challenge. I think there were lots of interesting considerations, the problem of evil and divine hiddenness. There are really robust philosophical versions of this. They might say, as someone who's a Christian, I've realized that atheism is much more plausible than I thought when I was a teenager. And similarly, it shouldn't be that surprising to hear an atheist who has for the past 10 years dedicated his life to studying philosophy and theology say that, there are some pretty good arguments on the other side. And speaking of not knowing what sources of information to trust and doing things for money, you'll also know if you've watched this channel for a while now that for some time I've been recommending a way to deal with bias in the online space. We can never get rid of bias, of course, but wouldn't it be great if there were a way for us as consumers of online media to navigate this space, objectively comparing the way that different news sources are reporting on the same story? Well, that's exactly what today's sponsor, Ground News, allows you to do. To help combat bias, Ground News aggregates thousands of local and international news outlets all in one place, so you can compare reporting across the political spectrum. Take a look at this story. The Pope recently held an hours-long meeting with survivors of clerical abuse. Right-wing headlines say things like, the Pope met with 15 abuse victims, whereas the only left-leaning source, CNN, quoted the profound and painful nature of this meeting. And little things like this across the whole spectrum of news can subtly affect the way that you're interpreting the events of the world. So Ground News also has a dedicated blind spot tab, which specifically seeks out stories that you would otherwise miss based on the news that you normally read. So cut through the bias for yourself by going to ground.news/AlexOC or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen. Use my link to get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. And with that said, let's talk about some online bias, shall we? The thing that really annoys me is that there are two kinds of responses to this video that I've been getting that I don't like. One is from the Christian community who say, aha, I knew it. He's on the verge of conversion. He's definitely about to become a Christian, and we're just waiting for Jesus to fully open his eyes, or something like that. The second is from atheist listeners who think that I've essentially lost my mind. And that also tends to come along with this idea that I'm grifting, right? That I'm kind of trying to cotton onto a trend and, make more money off pretending to be nearly a Christian or something. Alex sees that there is a massive fascistic turn happening and is now becoming Christian to save his own skin. Cowardly. What a fraud. Just fast forward to your inevitable coming to Jesus moment and stop wasting people's time. You can pivot your channel's content to atheist converts to Christianity and realizes how wrong he was all along. The Bible thumpers will eat it up. Sad to see stupidity prevail over logic and intelligence. Sad atheist grift failed. Time to jump on the megachurch conversion Christian tour. It's sad and pathetic to watch someone who was once respectable turn into a complete grifter. So, how much did the lobby pay you? Alex is quasi-famous now, and he can't afford a haircut that doesn't look like a small dead animal on his head. Actually, that one's fair enough. Oh dear, now old Alex has fallen too. Only Dawkins left. I'm sorry, but fallen from what? Fallen from the kind of steadfast atheism which says that there is literally no such thing as a plausible argument for religion or Christianity. That there's not one marginally good reason to think that religion or Christianity might be true. If that's your position, we're just not on the same page. But that is not the same thing as becoming a Christian or being on the verge of doing so. And to prove it, I just want to show you something. So this video was taken from my second YouTube channel, More Alex O'Connor, and I just want to show you some other YouTube video titles from that self-same YouTube channel. Debating why the Bible isn't true versus Dinesh D'Souza. Was Jesus the serpent in the Garden of Eden? Pressing Ben Shapiro on contradictions in Scripture. Why contradictions in the Bible matter. And across my content, I've got videos explaining why I think Jesus didn't claim to be God. Where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only
in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too.
Why the problem of evil is the biggest problem for Christianity.
I don't think I'd expect to see anything like this circus of suffering.
How the Bible obviously contains falsehoods and mythologies and often contradicts itself.
Every contradiction? All of them? How about, for instance?
How I think the Bible promotes sexism. If there is something they want to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. And slavery.
The scriptural injunctions towards the ownership of other human beings as private property, the bequeathing of them to your children as inheritable property, and the differential treatment of slaves who are Israelites and slaves who are not.
And genocide.
I get sick to death of people hand-waving away this genocide by some vague reference to the fact that Jesus came along to do something which somehow kind of undoes the immorality of it.
And so, in the face of all of that, one clip in which I say, yeah, Christianity has got something going for it, and it's got more going for it than I realized when I was a teenager, causes like this kind of reaction. And I think that some of the responses I've been getting to this demonstrate an incredibly low barrier of intellectual engagement, right? Because if you just saying that the other side, so to speak, is maybe more plausible than some people give it credit for, and actually there are some good reasons to disagree with my position. I still believe what I believe, but I think there are good reasons that I have to tackle on the other side. If just saying that is enough to get accusations that you either must be on the brink of a conversion or you're outwardly grifting to the other side, what does that say about the state of our ability online to have conversations about important topics? I think that the starting point of an interesting conversation should be, I think that what you're saying is really interesting and plausible, but I disagree with it, and I'm going to tell you why. If our starting point is just, there is nothing you could possibly say that will rationally convince me, because your position is rationally indefensible. Not only that, but it's also evil and a terrible force in the world. And right now, I just don't think there is anything you could possibly say to me at all to convince me that your worldview is even more plausible than its fiercest enemies propose. If that's where you're at, then fair enough, you can hold that view. I can understand looking at religions like Christianity, or for a Christian looking at atheism and just thinking that is nonsense and there is no way I can even take that seriously. Fine, you can do that, but that's not what I'm engaged in. I'm trying to have interesting conversations with people because I think that most people have something interesting to say. But I also kind of can't blame people for thinking that I am jumping on some Christian grift, because Christians keep repurposing my material for their hopeful worship music in the background, Instagram reels talking about how great Jesus is. Sometimes when I'm asked about Christianity or religion on a podcast or something, my co-conversationalist doesn't know that much about Christianity, or is interested but hasn't really cared about it, or is someone who is a fervent atheist. And in any of those situations, it will serve the conversation quite well for me to try to steel man Christianity, for me to say, well, hold on a second, I think there are good reasons to believe in God. And it does make sense why a Christian would be convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. Here are some of the arguments. How do we explain the fact that this man gets crucified by the Romans, and then people claim to see him after he died, and were willing to be put to death for that belief? Isn't that incredible? How do we explain this? Something really weird must have happened. And then they will always ask me, so hold on then, what's your explanation? And I go, well, there is still enough disagreement that I think to arouse suspicion. I'm saying this as if I'm some kind of Christian or theist. I sort of put on that hat when I'm asked to have a conversation of this kind. It does seem to me suspicious, for example, that the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest gospel, contains no post-resurrection appearances. And then the Gospel of Matthew does include post-resurrection appearances. The Gospel of Luke includes even more. It's only in the Gospel of John that we get, for instance, doubting Thomas. So I think that there's this reason to distrust the Gospel accounts, or there's mythological development if you look at the earliest Gospel Mark and then look at the latest John and see how things change. And I start talking about those more atheistic points. But somebody always, inevitably, without fail, takes that first bit, clips it up, makes it black and white, puts some hopeful music in the background, and puts it onto some Jesus Instagram page. How do we explain the fact that this man gets crucified by the Romans, and then people claim to see him after he died? And just to show you how bad and dishonest this can get, let me show you one of the most popular reels of this kind. 45,000 likes. The caption is, Jesus' genius moment. #God, #Jesus, #Christianity, #4U page. So let's take a look at this. It's one of my favorite stories in the Gospels, where Jesus says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." Because it's a religious test, because you've got this Jesus, peaceful figure, and there's a woman who's committed adultery, and the law's quite clear that the woman should be stoned. And Jesus is just like writing in the sand, and the Pharisees are like, okay, come on then, Jesus, what are you going to do here? It clearly says that she should be stoned. That's what the law says. And he's like writing in the sand. He's kind of ignoring them. And they say, Jesus, what should we do here? The law's quite clear. We need to stone this woman. And they're testing him. What's he going to do? And he says, sure, yeah, okay, go ahead. But he who's without sin casts the first stone. Oh, man, it's brilliant. It's awesome. It's like ethical genius. It sort of undercuts at the same time as not contradicting the truth of the law or the justice. It's this brilliant moment. It's this brilliant moment. Yeah, that does sound pretty pro-Christianity, doesn't it? And look at some of the comments. He is so close to Jesus. Bro's starting to get it. He's so close. Times like 15. Okay, you want to see something funny? Let's look at where that clip was taken from and listen to the very next words out of my mouth. It's this brilliant moment, but unfortunately, it's not in our earliest manuscripts, and so most scholars believe that it's a later interpolation. But unfortunately, it's not in our earliest manuscripts, and so most scholars believe it's a later interpolation. That is to say that our earliest manuscripts of John's Gospel, the only Gospel in which you'll find this story today, don't contain this story, indicating that at some point it was added in later. It wasn't a part of the original Gospel. I mean, look, to make this really clear, let's go back for a moment and look at what Chris actually asked me. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe that was, a later interpolation, because the Quran is the word of God.
What's an interpolation?
Oh, like a later edition.
Okay.
So something that's added later into the text. So like earlier I mentioned the stoning of the adulterous woman, which is it's one of my favorite stories in the Gospels. And that's where the reel starts, right? So Chris has asked me, what's an interpolation? I say, well, it's when someone has kind of taken a text and like sneakily added in something later that isn't historical. Then I start explaining this story. That's where the reel starts. Then the reel ends, immediately after which I say, it's this brilliant moment, but unfortunately, it's not in our earliest manuscripts. And so most scholars believe that it's a later interpolation. So in this moment on Chris Williamson's podcast, I'm arguing for the unreliability of the gospel narrative. And someone has chopped off the context either side, made it black and white, put some fancy music behind it, and is now trying to pass it off as a kind of pro-Jesus piece of content. I mean, the reason why I'm saying, this is my favorite story in the Gospels, and I think Jesus is so cool here, is to point out that some of my favorite parts about who Jesus is aren't historical. They're not really part of the original gospel narrative. And you know what's really annoying about this? Because these are literally the next words out of my mouth, whoever edited this reel knew what they were doing. They fully knew the point that I was trying to make. They had listened through and were waiting for a moment to pull, and they just knew that I was arguing here that this is not a historical story. And they've just taken it anyway and turned it into some Christian content. And I see these kinds of reels and TikToks all the time. People keep taking my material and turning it into pro-Christian content. Look, here's another example from He Chose You on Instagram. Alex O'Connor admits to be Christian. I'll save you some time. I did not do that. Here's a more recent example from Speak Life. 42,000 likes. Stephen Bartlett is saying that he used to be an atheist, and just look at my face.
Such a staunch atheist. And I read all those books at 18 years old, and I was debating dog walkers on the street. But I now find myself in a position where I'm almost back to being curious again.
Man, it kind of looks like I'm praying or something, except I didn't make those faces in that moment. Those expressions are taken from a different part of the podcast around half an hour later and just spliced in for some reason. And of course, the clip ends with my recommendation to read the Gospels.
What would you suggest?
If it seemed to me going to church or reading Gospels might provide that for him, then I'd probably recommend that he did that. But neglect to mention that this is just one option I give, among others, including taking psychedelic drugs.
If he came to you and he was your friend in Dubai, and he said, my life is lacking meaning, I can't get out of bed anymore, what would you prescribe him? What would you recommend? What would you suggest as he's your friend?
It's hard to know without knowing that friend. But if it seemed to me like going to church or reading the Gospels might provide that for him, then I'd probably recommend that he did that. But I think that literally the subjective feeling of meaning is usually tied up in the identification of something that transcends your individual self.
Yeah. Well,
right?
Why would you?
And I think whatever is the most plausible course of action for that person to engage in something like that would be what I would recommend for them. If maybe they're not particularly interested in religion, I'd recommend that they read some philosophy of mind and try to understand the nature of consciousness. And I might recommend, depending on who they are, that they take a psychedelic drug and try to experience something which cannot be put into words. I wasn't asked where someone should go for philosophical truth. I was asked what I would recommend a friend do if they were feeling depressed. And if I thought that reading the Bible would help my friend to stop being depressed, I'd tell them to read the Bible. If I thought that studying philosophy of mind would do that, I'd tell them to do that, because that's a totally different question to what I think is true. I mean, just type in Alex O'Connor Christianity into TikTok or Instagram or something, and you will just see this endless list of videos which make it seem as though I'm some kind of Christian apologist. By the way, in all of these clips, I've replaced the backing music to something similar, but that's not going to get me a copyright strike. But just imagine like No Surprises by Radiohead, or like some famous Christian piano worship music. That's the stuff that's actually there. Like, it's actually kind of annoying. It would be a bit like if a Christian, say John Lennox or somebody, were to sit for an interview and say, the first thing I want to say is that atheists need to be taken seriously. The problem of evil is a serious challenge, and I can understand why that would make someone doubt the existence of God. And then he goes on to say, but this is my answer. If somebody just like clipped that first bit where he says that the problem of evil is a really good reason not to believe in God, and they like uploaded it onto an atheist Instagram account and made it all black and white and put some dramatic music in the background and tried to like pass it off as if John Lennox was arguing for atheism, I think that would be, shall we say, a little bit unfair to him, and unfair to the people who are watching, who now think that John Lennox believes something that he doesn't. And I don't really mind it. It's the internet. You can't stop people from doing things like that. And anybody who's that interested could take 5 minutes to check the source material and realize the context in which I'm speaking, or look at any of my other work and realize that I'm not exactly on board with Orthodox Christianity. But just bear that in mind, maybe the next time you see one of these reels or TikToks, and certainly the next time you see me talking positively about Christianity and saying that it might be more plausible than the new atheists give it credit for. Please do not read this as me being on the verge of a conversion, and certainly don't read it as me partaking in some kind of grift. I mean, seriously, think about this for just a moment. Suppose I were trying to, grift. Suppose I were trying to sort of get the Christians on board. I want their money. I want the popularity of Christianity. Do you think it would make any sense if I were trying to grift in this way? That, yeah, sure, I'll say Christianity is more plausible than Richard Dawkins thinks that it is, which is not saying much. But at the same time, I'll say things like,
the God that you believe in is acting like a tribal war god.
We don't have anything like this kind of extant written testimony for the resurrection of Jesus.
At best, this text says one thing on one day and another on the next. There is just no way to come away from it thinking that God was not okay with the ownership of other human beings, with bequeathing them to children as inheritable private property, with mistreatment of them so long as they're not an Israelite slave, and therefore also doing it based on, I would say, maybe race, maybe tribe, whatever term you want to use.
Yeah, it really sounds like I'm trying to grift Christianity, or that I'm on the verge of some kind of inevitable conversion. And look, I do understand that like choosing a particular moment and like turning it into a clip can say something in itself. I mean, yeah, sure, okay, you're just saying that Christianity isn't complete and utter nonsense, but like, why do you have to choose that moment to make a clip out of? We're churning out clips all the time, and I'm really happy with the engagement that I'm getting on these videos, but just bear in mind that this is one video in amongst a Niagara of critical material trying to tell you why Christianity is false and why the Bible contradicts itself and why religion doesn't make sense and all that kind of stuff. It's still there. I'm still not a believer in God. I still make pro-atheist content. And also, as far as, pro-Christian content goes, I think this is like about as mild as it could conceivably get. Like, seriously, I'm not even giving like arguments for God's existence in this clip. I'm not like running the cosmological argument or, explaining the arguments for the historicity of the resurrection or something. I'm literally just like reporting an internal state over the past 10 years, I cannot think of a like milder contribution to this kind of discussion that is not like anti-Christian. I don't think I could have been like softer in the slightly friendly to Christianity direction, and yet it has garnered this kind of response. It really does make me think that unless I keep making videos exclusively about why religion is completely irrational and has absolutely nothing going for it, and also my position hasn't changed in 10 years of doing this professionally, which, by the way, if that were the case, should probably be reason to distrust me, that unless I steadfastly hold to that position and don't change it and never take religion seriously, Christians will inevitably say that I'm about to become a Christian, and atheists will inevitably say that I'm about to pretend to become a Christian to make a bunch more money. If that is what you think, then fine, there's nothing I can do about that. I do see it as kind of depressing that such a minor, as I see it, comment like this can inspire such a reaction. But all I can say here is that I hope the rest of you can see that I'm just like genuinely interested in this kind of stuff. I also hope that if you follow my work at all, like if you've seen some of the videos that I've been putting out recently, it's just immediately obvious to you that I'm not about to become a Christian, and that, yeah, I am taking it more seriously and I'm having more productive conversations across the aisle, as it were, but that, yeah, I retain quite a lot of criticism for that worldview. But I can't prove that. And of course, that is just what I would say if I were trying to grift Christianity, or I suppose secretly on the verge of conversion that I didn't want to make public for some reason. I can't prove that that's not the case, so you'll just have to trust me. Or don't. Whatever.